If your whole paycheck is already spoken for before it ever touches your hand, if you are the last name on a list you wrote yourself, this story is for you. Gwen Tillman saved $3,800 in a single year without one extra dollar coming in, and she did it by finally taking the first slice instead of the last crumb. For 30 years, her share of her own money had been whatever happened to be left. And there was never anything left. She would find that out at 54, standing at a meat counter, holding a pin she'd never once worn. Gwen worked the deli at the Foodway out on the southern bypass in Montgomery, slicing bologna and turkey and hoop cheese for folks she'd known her whole life. She was good at it, fast and clean, and she liked the little bell over the door and the way people said her name. She had done it for going on 20 years, standing on a rubber mat that had worn through to the concrete in the shape of her own 2 feet. Her days ran on rails, up in the dark to fix a plate and cover it, catch the first bus out the bypass, tie the apron, flip on the slicer, and let the cold of the deli case settle into her hands until they ached at the knuckles by noon. She smelled like waxed paper and cold cuts by the time she got home, a smell that never fully washed out of her, and her ankles by then had swelled soft over the tops of her shoes. Between the deli and the little bit of house cleaning she still took on for a lady over in Cloverdale, a good week was more money than passed through some hands that had a diploma on the wall. But money went through Gwen's hands like meal through a sifter. It came in on Friday, and by Sunday it was gone to everybody but her, and she could not have told you a single thing it had bought that was hers, because there had never been one. Nobody in that family ever asked Gwen what she made. Nobody asked what she kept. They only ever asked in that easy way whether there was any. Payday was Friday, and by Friday afternoon that check was already cut into pieces in Gwen's head before she ever signed the back of it. Rent first, then the note on her daughter Renata's car, because Renata was young and working, and it would only be for a little while, and the little while had been 3 years. Then her brother Curtis's phone bill, because Curtis had a way of calling that made no sound like an emergency, then the church, which she gave to gladly, then the light and the gas and the copay on her sugar pills. Somewhere at the very bottom of that list, if you looked hard, there was no line for Gwen. She had never written one. It would have felt like reaching across the table and taking food off her own children's plates. A decent woman, her mama used to say, eats last and eats least. Gwen had heard that at a kitchen table in Washington Park before she was tall enough to see over it, and she had lived it so completely that she'd forgotten it was ever a choice. If you don't know this channel, it was made for women who always eat last. Women like Gwen. Women like you. Stay with us a minute. There was one thing Gwen owned that had nothing to do with anybody else. In a drawer in her bedroom, under a stack of ironed handkerchiefs, was a small enamel pin shaped like a bluebird, the blue gone soft and pretty with age. She bought it at a 5 and dime downtown when she was 18, with the first money she ever made cleaning house, before Renata, before Curtis needed anything, before she was anybody's anything. The woman at the counter had wrapped it in tissue, and Gwen had carried it home like it was made of glass. And then she had put it in a drawer. For 36 years she had taken it out, looked at it, and put it back, because there had never once been an occasion she felt was hers enough to wear it to. The day the counter caved in was a Friday like all of them. Gwen cashed her check and paid it all out, envelope by envelope, and when she was done, she stood at her own kitchen counter, and there was $11 left, and out of that $11 Renata called needing gas to get to work, and Gwen gave it. Of course she gave it. And then she sat down at the table with nothing at all in front of her, not even a cup of coffee she'd made for herself. And she could not for the life of her remember the last thing she had bought that was only for Gwen. She believed, sitting there, that this was just what a mother was, what a good woman was. She had believed it for 54 years. And maybe that was exactly why she had never once tried to keep a single dollar, because to keep it, she would have had to believe she was somebody worth keeping it for, and no one had ever told her she was, least of all herself. It was the next week, at the meat counter, that Miss Virgie set it loose without meaning to. Miss Virgie Dean was near 80 and came in every Wednesday for a quarter-pound of liver and a visit, and she leaned on the glass case and watched Gwen work and talked about her own long life the way old women do, like they're reading it off the ceiling. She was telling about her late husband, about how she'd raised 6 children and buried 2, and worked in the laundry at Maxwell Field for 29 years. And she said, wrapping her own thin hand around the edge of the case, not looking at Gwen at all, "You know what took me the longest to learn, baby? You can't pour from a jug you never once let fill." She said it easy, like she was talking about the liver. She wasn't handing down anything. She patted the glass and asked was the liver fresh, and moved on to the price of eggs. But Gwen's hands slowed on the slicer. She wrapped the quarter-pound of liver and she said, "Yes, ma'am," which is what you say. And something had come loose in her chest and was rolling around in there, and she couldn't get it to sit still. That evening she was quiet through supper. She washed the dishes and dried them and stood at the sink after, with the dish rag in her hand, wringing it and wringing it, though it was already wrung dry. Outside the kitchen window, a dog 3 yards down was barking at nothing and would not quit. She hung the rag over the faucet, then she took it down and hung it straighter. "A jug you never once let fill." She didn't know why the words wouldn't leave her. She was tired and her feet hurt at the burning place they always burned, and there was nobody to be cross at, so she went to bed, cross at the dog. She thought about Miss Virgie in that laundry at Maxwell Field, 29 years of other people's sheets, and how the old woman had said the thing about the jug like a woman who'd paid full price to learn it. Gwen wondered when Miss Virgie had learned to let her own jug fill, and whether it had come too late or just in time, and whether there was even such a thing as just in time for a woman like them. She dried the same 2 glasses again. She straightened the towel that was already straight. Her hands, she noticed, were always tidying something that belonged to the house, always closing some small thing up neat, and never once in her life had they been busy with anything that was only hers. She lay there a long time. She thought about Miss Virgie in that laundry 29 years, and about her own 20 years on a mat worn through in the shape of her feet, and about how there was a bluebird pin in a drawer 8 feet away that she had owned for 36 years and never worn, because she had never once decided that Gwen deserved an occasion, and that, more than the money, more than anything, was the thing that would not let her sleep. Not the empty wallet, the empty drawer, the pin waiting on a life that never got around to her. She got up before light like always. She made the coffee and covered a plate. She caught the bus out to the bypass and stood on her mat and sliced and wrapped and smiled and said folks' names. And when a woman paid her too much by accident and Gwen counted the change back careful into her hand, she felt her own fingers do the thing they always did, giving it all back, keeping nothing, and for the first time in her life she noticed she was doing it. And the noticing was so strange, it near about stopped her breath. That Friday, she cashed her check, same as every Friday. And she stood in the parking lot of the Foodway with the money in her hand, and before she could think herself out of it, before the list in her head could start cutting, she peeled off 2 20s and a $10, $50 off the very top, and she folded it small and pushed it down into the bottom of her purse, where she kept nothing, and only then did she go home and start paying everybody else. $50. Less than Curtis ran up on that phone in a month without anybody calling it a sin. And her hands shook doing it, they honestly shook, like she was stealing. And the shame of it followed her all the way home and sat with her at the table. She had cut herself the first slice for the first time in her life, and it felt like a crime. It didn't take the first time, not clean. The very next Friday, the list got loud. Renata's insurance was past due, and there was a shut-off notice on the gas. And Gwen took her 50 back out of the bottom of the purse before she'd even left the parking lot and paid it toward the gas. And she drove home, telling herself she'd start again when things settled, the way things were always about to settle and never did. But that Sunday, sitting in the pew with the offering basket coming down the row, she watched her own hand put a folded bill in the basket without a thought, without a tremble, glad to give, and she understood something that turned her cold and then warm. She could give to the church without flinching. She could give to Curtis, to Renata, to a stranger. The only person on God's earth Gwen could not bring herself to give to was Gwen. She had a jug in her chest she had let everybody drink from for 54 years and had never once held under the tap herself. That was the week the first cut finally held. 50 off the top, every Friday, into the bottom of the purse, then into a coffee can, then into a passbook from the credit union. She opened on her lunch break with her own name on it, Gwen Ella Tillman, spelled out in a girl's careful hand at the window because her own hand had gone shaky signing it. She told herself it was nothing. $50 was nothing, she'd say, folding it down into the purse. And then, some Fridays, she'd have to say it twice to get her fingers to let go of the fold, because a part of her still stood at that kitchen table, hearing her mama say, "Eats last, eats least." And that part of her was certain that a woman who took the first slice would answer for it somehow, that a hand would come down. No hand came down. The lights stayed on. Renata still got where she needed to go. Curtis still called. The house did not fall in because Gwen kept $50 nobody had counted on. And the not falling in was its own kind of loud, a silence where a punishment was supposed to be, and Gwen kept waiting in it and kept not being punished. And slowly, Friday by Friday, she started to believe the floor might hold. There is a kind of quiet no one ever claps for. It is the quiet of a woman deciding, in a parking lot, with nobody watching, that she is finally on her own list, that she is worth the first slice and not the last crumb. And that quiet, held week after week where no one can see, is a woman learning her own name again. Some Fridays were lean and the 50 was hard, and the old voice sat right down beside her. Eats last, eats least. Twice she near about gave it back. Both times she thought of that bluebird in the dark drawer, and she folded the 50 smaller and pushed it down deeper instead. By the 8th month, the passbook said $2,600, which was more money than had ever in her life belonged to Gwen alone, and she would take it out at night after the house was sleeping and just hold it, the little blue book, and run her thumb over the number, and feel a thing she had no word for, something between fear and joy, the feeling of a woman standing in a doorway she'd been afraid of her whole life, and finding it opened onto her own yard. The change in Gwen was not loud because she never let it be, but it showed. It showed the afternoon Curtis called with that soundless emergency in his voice, and Gwen, drying her hands on a dish towel, heard herself say, gentle and plain, that she loved him, but she couldn't this month, and then she did the thing she had never once done in 54 years. She let the silence after it just sit there, and she didn't rush in to fix it or say sorry. And Curtis grumbled and got off the phone, and the world did not end. She stood in her kitchen with her heart going and her hands steady, and she felt like she'd stepped off a high step in the dark and landed on solid ground. The change came slow, and it came with a cost, the way real change does. There were nights she felt selfish clear down to her shoes, nights the old voice won around, and she skipped the 50 and hated herself Saturday for the skipping. There were nights she sat with the little blue passbook and cried, without exactly knowing why, cried the way you cry when something that should have been yours all along finally is, and you can feel all the years it wasn't. But she kept cutting the first slice. It stopped shaking her hands somewhere in the 5th month. By the seventh, it felt less like stealing and more like breathing, and she caught herself one Friday humming at the credit union window, humming a thing she hadn't done at a bank in her life. By the end of the year, the number was $3,800. No raise, no windfall. Just the first slice instead of the last crumb, week after week in the quiet. And there was a new girl on the register at the foodway, Tanika, 25, a baby at home and a boyfriend who held the money and held it wrong. Gwen watched her cash her check on Fridays and pay it all out over the phone in the break room before she'd even clocked back in and go quiet after, that flat quiet. And Gwen knew that quiet the way you know your own mother's voice through a wall. It was her own quiet, 30 years of it, standing in the doorway of her own life. One slow evening, Gwen took the girl back by the deli case and, wrapping cheese she'd already wrapped, she told her, "Not all of it, just the parking lot, and the 50, and the jug you never let fill." And she watched Tanika's face do the thing her own face had done at that meat counter, the thing that happens when somebody tells you out loud that you are allowed to be on your own list. Tanika looked at her the way you look at somebody speaking a language you used to know as a child, half hopeful and half sure it's a trick. She said she couldn't spare 50. Nobody could spare 50. That was the whole trouble. Everybody wanted a piece, and there was never enough pieces to go around. And Gwen said she knew. Lord, did she know? She'd said the same words in the same break room to herself for 20 years. And Gwen said the truest thing she knew, and it came out shaped like Miss Virgie, though Gwen never meant it to. She said it doesn't have to be 50. Cut yourself the first slice, whatever it is. $1, a quarter. Cut it first, before you cut anybody else, because the last crumb is a lie, baby. There is never any last crumb. They will always find a use for it. The only piece that is ever really yours is the one you take first. And that night Gwen came home, and she opened the drawer, and she took the bluebird pin out from under the stack of handkerchiefs where it had waited 36 years for an occasion that was hers enough. And she looked at it a long time in the lamplight. And then she pinned it to her collar. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special was happening. No birthday, no church program, no reason a soul would notice. That was exactly the point. For 36 years she had waited for an occasion big enough to deserve, and she saw now there was never going to be one handed to her, that the occasion was just her own ordinary self, on an ordinary night, and that had always been enough, and nobody had ever told her so. She wore it to bed that night and to the foodway the next morning, a little soft blue bird right over her heart, and when a customer said, "Why, Gwen, that's pretty, where'd you get that?" Gwen smiled and said, "I bought it for myself," and for the first time in her whole life she said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Before you go, do this one thing for me. In the comments write, 'I took the first slice.' Just that. I want to read everyone, because somebody scrolling by right now is still eating the last crumb and needs to see that other women stopped. And if this story found you, stay close. Tap subscribe and turn on the bell so the next one comes right to you, because there is a new story here every week, and one of them was written for you. If you want to start today, there is a free app that will help you put order to all of this, gentle and simple. The link is down in the comments. And hear me, you are not the last name on the list. You never were. Cut yourself the first slice tonight, quiet, where nobody claps, and put that little bird right over your heart where it belongs. I'll see you next week.